As the Knesset dissolves, a new Prime Minister comes in and an outgoing one says goodbye to politics. Israel is once again in a state of limbo. Elections have been penciled in for the 1st of November, and opinion polls are once again suggesting a political stalemate, with Benjamin Netanyahu's Likud party comfortably leading, followed by new interim Prime Minister Yair Lapid's Yesh Atid. But neither has enough support to form a viable coalition. But with Naftali Bennett dropping out of politics, having failed to make a mishmash anti-Netanyahu coalition work, and with many parties still reluctant to join with Netanyahu, what next? Will the parties be willing to make a compromise to avoid another endless cycle of elections? Is Netanyahu going to make the second prime ministerial comeback of his career? Will Lapid remain prime minister for the near future, not because he was elected, but by default? What next for Israeli politics?
So let's get to it. What is next for Israeli politics? Dear gentlemen, you know the rules. You each get 30 seconds to lay out your initial stance, and we pick up the debate right after. Mr. Perry, please take the lead.
I think we're going to see a tremendously emotional and aggressive campaign between the two halves of Israel, basically. One that is more traditional, conservative, religious, and disinclined to change anything as regards the West Bank. And the other that is more liberal, more moderate, more modern, more universal. The two sides really despise each other, and it will, I think, sort of crystallize into the question of whether Netanyahu can return or in fact, probably go home. Sadly, I don't think they're going to address head-on the main issues that really do confront the country.
Yes, another referendum on Netanyahu, so to speak. Dr. Schwartz, your take?
I would certainly agree with my predecessor's characterization of Israeli society. It's highly divided. However, the past 4 election campaigns were primarily about the continued premiership of Netanyahu, and not so much about philosophy or ideology. I'm sad to see this government finishing its term so quickly. I think they sent an important message to the Israeli public that parties that are very different ideologically and otherwise can still work together with humility, with teamwork, and that agreements can be honored, something the Israeli public, I think, has forgotten.
Jeremy Saltan from the busy corridors of Parliament, your take?
My take is that we all wish that we would have been able to have this coalition stick together for longer than the year plus that it did. But frankly, it was a miracle that we're able to have this very fragile coalition that started out with just 61 out of the 120 members of Knesset and maintain it as long as we did. This was a historic moment of a coalition of both Jews and Arabs, right and left, secular and religious, native Israelis together with immigrants. And I'm very proud of the government and its track record over this year.
Well, gentlemen, from this point onwards, please feel free to interact. And touching that point exactly, overall, let's stick with the hindsight for a second. Did the mere formation of this government change the jigsaw puzzle called Israeli politics, or are we more or less in the same spot, Mr. Perry?
I think it did 2 very important things. One, it showed that there are people in the classic Israeli right wing who reject the authoritarian direction in which the right wing, not just in Israel, but in much of the world, has taken. Essentially a moderate right wing, not unlike what you see in America with, let's say, the Mitt Romney wing of the Republican Party. The second thing is they allowed an Arab party into the coalition, and the Arab Party agreed to come into the coalition formally. And this has never happened before. These 2 things, I think, set a precedent, but also prove, despite the difficulties that we saw, that it is possible, at least for a year and a month. I think you'll see more of that going forward.
Dr. Schwartz, is the pendulum shifting back, or will we see more such, let's call it political maneuvers that will form different types of less intuitive government, so to speak?
At the risk of repeating myself, this election will most likely once again be about the continued rule of Benjamin Netanyahu and his taking center stage in Israel's political arena. What I think is ironic is that the Arab Party Ram that was part of this outgoing government, it was mentioned already, the person who actually opened the door for that party to take an active role in government was Netanyahu himself. Of course, it was done in a move of desperation, but I think it's become, or is slowly becoming, a norm in Israeli politics that makes Israel's body politic that much more inclusive. I think it's important. It's an important lesson we can all take into the future.
By the way, if I may interject, I think it is truly a little bit pitiful that people like Bennett in the outgoing government say that they only allowed Ram into the coalition because Netanyahu set the precedent by negotiating with him. By doing that, they actually validate the idea that Netanyahu is some kind of arbitrator of what is legitimate in Israeli politics. And each time they do it once more and they say, Netanyahu, you started the flirtation with Mansour Abbas of Ram, I just shake my head in stupefaction, because it really does hand the reins to Netanyahu.
As long as the discourse surrounds around Netanyahu, again, yes or no, he's still at the epicenter of everything. But from one former premier to another former premier, Naftali Bennett, detonating a political bombshell, not too surprising for many, saying he's not going to run in the next elections. Jeremy Saltan, out for good, or just, sitting this one out?
I think we will see the outgoing Prime Minister Naftali Bennett return to the political arena. I definitely see this as a break or a recess, if you will. And I think that's also understandable after really what was perhaps the most intensive, at least, year that I've seen. I've been working here within the corridors of the Knesset for about 15 years now. I do not recall any year being anywhere close to what it is that we dealt with over this past year. But I do think he will come back.
And speaking of Naftali Bennett and somewhat of the torchland that he's leaving behind him, when we're talking about the Yamina Party, the biggest losers, perhaps, and I will say it carefully, from this round is Ayelet Shaked, his longtime running mate, now taking over the non-existent party question mark, the no constituency question mark, the no ideology question mark, Dr. Schwartz?
Well, let me first offer some words of praise for Prime Minister Bennett, outgoing Prime Minister Bennett. Former American President Harry Truman once said, "It's amazing what you can accomplish if you don't care who gets the credit." And I think this very much embodied the work of this past government, particularly Bennett. And so I, for one, am sorry to see him go, and I tend to agree with Jeremy that I think it would be a bit too premature to eulogize him politically. You mentioned Ayelet Shaked as perhaps one of the losers. As much as Bennett, I believe, was an effective prime minister in the 1 year of his term, he was a fairly ineffective party leader. And the fact that the main defectors from this government, which caused us to be in the situation we are in today, were from his own party, is certainly a shortcoming of his. I think it also points to him having chosen people who, to borrow an American baseball metaphor, people who were born on third base and think they hit a triple. I think
that's a nice one.
by leaders who are able to sublimate their own ego concerns, but unfortunately some of the more minor deputies seem to have forgotten that lesson, and again, that's why we're where we are today.
I think when you speak of Ayelet Shaked,
I'm going to jump in here.
Please.
I just want to say that there was not one piece of legislation that fell because of Yamina over the last year plus of this government. And also there was not one Yamina MK that voted against the coalition discipline when it came to what the expected government was.
Well, Jeremy,
now,
come on, we cannot present that as a success.
Came from the other side.
One cannot help think of the Israeli expression.
I'd like to finish my point.
Please.
I'd like to finish my point here that the ones that voted against the government and against the coalition discipline were from the Meretz Party and from the Ra'am Party led by Mansour Abbas. Yamina, if you look at the actual voting track record, was one of the most disciplined parties of this coalition.
May I rebut that?
Please, Dan.
There were several key pieces of legislation that would have been signature achievements for this coalition that weren't even brought to the Knesset because of Yamina. And we're talking about the legislation that would have prevented a criminal defendant from setting up a government in Israel and
what
others.
Should have been the jewel of this
which would have been the jewel. And the fact that that wasn't done because of Yamina right now is a very big anchor weighing down the coming campaign. This and more. Yamina MKs may not have voted against the government actively, but they abandoned the government. Indeed, 3 or 4 were either abandoning the government or threatening to abandon the government out of 7. And, politics is a lot about momentum. That established the momentum that basically, in the end, didn't bring down the government, but caused them to fold up stakes and try again.
Well, Jeremy,
it came mostly from Yamina.
Jeremy rightfully mentioned the leftist Labor and Merits parties, and we'll get to them after the break. But before we conclude this part of the debate, speaking of perhaps the wiser politicians, if I may, the new incoming Prime Minister Yair Lapid, some would suggest against all odds, played his political cards quite right. But the question is it enough? According to all polls, and he has grain of salt, etc., he has no ability to form the next government.
I would disagree. I think if the anti-Netanyahu, anti-authoritarian range of parties in the Knesset gets a majority again, then we'll have a repeat of what happened last time. I think the interesting thing is with the Yamina Party. That was on the fence before. It's not clear if it, and Bennett was tempted over creating a majority even without the Joint Arab Party by offering him the prime ministership. It isn't clear whether Ayelet Shaked is willing to play that role again. I think most people expect her to rejoin the authoritarian right fully. And that really reshuffles the deck. When people figure this out, I think the polls will change accordingly, and I would be almost surprised if she passed the electoral threshold.
Well, we'll get to the electoral threshold as well. But Dr. Schwartz, economy, security, diplomacy, is there anything on the table of new incoming Prime Minister Yair Lapid other than politics, or is it all about campaigning until November 1st?
Well, I think in his short stint as foreign minister, one of his main achievements was the restoration of bipartisan support for Israel in the U.S. Congress, something that Netanyahu willingly sacrificed on the altar of his own power. So I think that alone is worth singling out. I just have to refer to something Jeremy said earlier about the role of Yamina in this government. I couldn't help think of the famous Israeli saying that the operation succeeded, but the patient died.
Yeah.
I mean, we're today precisely because the government wasn't able to sustain itself, largely because of the behavior of Yamina deputies and others as well. And I have to agree with Dan. I think it's much too early to call. The very existence of this outgoing government suggests, I think, is a sobering lesson to all of us that politics are, in this country at least, are really not very predictable. It's very possible that the ultra-Orthodox parties, or at least a portion thereof, after being an entire year out of power, may rethink their moves. It's possible that leadership within the Likud, when they realize that Netanyahu might, in fact, be once again faced with a plurality of voters, but the inability to form a government, they might well also draw the appropriate conclusions.